This is Katie Detweiler. She is passionate about the transformative power of lifelong learning and committed to the holistic and patient-centered missions of post-acute care. Katie was raised on several continents, including Africa and Europe, and her professional background includes a degree in education, as well as 10 years of home care and hospice experience with multiple software companies in a variety of roles ranging from support to process improvement and business development. Currently, she is a strategic partner manager at Relias Learning. In that role, Katie leverages her passion for education and the post-acute industry by building relationships that make meaningful education readily accessible to all learners. She's here to talk with us today about the role of continuing development and professional education as a component of your workforce and retention strategies. So thank you, Katie.
Absolutely. So as she indicated, I had a very interesting background growing up, and I have had to spend a lot of time thinking about the most effective way to communicate with people, whether that was language or, after moving around extensively growing up, and my parents were very matter of fact, have a nice first day in school, and I was put into public schools everywhere we went. So after figuring out the language aspect, I also entered into the realm of teaching, and I taught kindergarten for 5 years. And it was just as important then for what I was saying to be not just concisely and eloquently communicated, but that they would understand it and take it in. So I've had to do a lot of thinking about communication and how we transfer knowledge to other people throughout the variety of situations I've run into in my life. To me, absorbing the information that you're sharing is, there we go. There we go. That was just a few pictures I threw together from some of my experiences growing up. But so the key was the absorbing. It's not enough to just be able to communicate. You have to do that effectively. And I ran into this quote, and it just made me laugh. When primitive man ran into a tiger, he didn't ask how many teeth does it have. He asked, will it eat me? We need the big picture. We don't need all the details first. We need the big picture. And so as we move in our world of home care and hospice from pay for services to pay for performance, it becomes increasingly important for your staff to absorb the knowledge that you are giving them and the training that you're providing, whether that's onboarding, whether that's continuing education. It's important for them to absorb that and take that in, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are affecting outcomes. So we're going to go through really talking about when you're creating training at your organization, again, whether it's onboarding, whether it's continuing, there's some steps that need to go into it. And they spend a lot of time talking about the difference between learning for children and adults. And in my experience, there's really actually very few differences between teaching someone who's 5 and teaching an adult. The questions remain the same. The 5-year-old that's constantly asking why, we have those same questions. We think, what do I need to know on Monday when I go in the office? Why are you rambling on about this? Why does this matter to me? So we'll talk about the foundation of that is really your objective. So we'll talk about making sure that we design our training in a way that's meaningful to them, so how they learn and taking that into account, and creating a learning experience. I loved all the stories about the simulations that we just heard, because it is true. The experience, when you're entering into that, it adds to that value and the why. And then there's some trends out there like simulations that will help you accomplish this effectively. And then at the end of the day, real life. So, in our first presentation, we had a lot of conversations about how it's valuable to think about lofty goals, and then there's also real life to consider. How do we take some of these things and incorporate them into what we're actually doing? So starting out with learning objectives, help me poke holes in this learning objective. If you're a learner presented with this learning objective, what are some questions that you might have? Does anybody have any? How do I know if it's clean? How do I know that I have succeeded? What kind of wound? There's not a lot of details. How do I know what steps, or if there's even any direction, or if there's even any missing that I know in my, maybe I don't know what steps there are. To your point, how do I prove it? How do I prove that it's clean? So the focus in this learning objective, I don't know if you've built a lot of training or experienced a lot of training, but the focus here is very oriented around me and what I need you to know. Clearly there's a problem with people cleaning wounds effectively, and so I've decided this is something that needs to be taught, and so here's my learning objective, but it doesn't take my learner into account. It's focused on me, it's not focused on them. So this was what I was alluding to earlier, the 5-year-old syndrome. What's in it for me? This is going to be the key takeaway from this whole session. If you remember one thing, it's just what's in it for me. Adult learners have to have a what's in it for me if they're going to absorb what you're teaching them. They need to care. They enter into the learning experience more when they care and they know why it matters, and that means that they will own the information, become involved, and they will move from just knowing it to actually transitioning into a change in behavior and doing it. So we change it. We change it to be about the behavior that we need them to exhibit. So back to our point, what do I do differently at work on Monday? How does this affect my life? It's a matter of doing versus knowing. So now we've made it a little bit more clear. I need you to sequence the steps to clean a wound. So now I know that they need to be in a certain order. If we're going to work about outcomes, this is a much more productive approach. But there's still more missing. It's what steps. Remember, we talked about that still wasn't clear enough, so we need a condition as part of our learning objective. So given a list of steps, now we've got our behavior, sequence those steps to clean a wound, and then how do I know if I've been successful? With 100% accuracy. So all 3 of those components make me care a lot more. I've got a lot more detail. These are things I've run into in my life. I can see what's expected of me, and then again, what's going to show that I've proven to be efficient at this, that I've excelled at this, that I am performing. What's the criteria? So in order to do this in a way that's going to keep your learners engaged, we need to talk a little bit more about the process of how we learn. So I mentioned earlier, it's about going from knowing to actually doing. And so that's a 3-pronged approach, right? You've got the on-the-job question, my question of, okay, well, great, when I go in the office on Monday, how does that change my life? Or when I step into that patient home, what does that change? What do I need to do differently? So that's on the job. And that needs to be communicated in the course. So how do you prepare your learner in the most effective way for that on the job? So in the case of BIATA, they use scenarios and they use simulations to try to prepare. And then after the training, again, tying it back to that measure of success. If we're tying our training to outcomes, it's going to be really important to be able to measure that success of the training and make sure that they're actually doing what we're trying to get them to do in the course. So there's your behavior. There's our condition, which was the first arrow on our previous screen. And there's the criteria for success, the 100% or the 75% or the 90%, the criteria that says we've made it, this is affecting the change that we're looking for. So some of you might be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy or how we learn. This is meant to show in practical words that we use in our language and in our learning objectives and in our conversations and our training courses, how we're shifting that focus from just knowing the information to actually affecting a change and having them own that information in such a way that now they're thinking about it critically. So in that environment, they're able to make snap decisions. They're able to do things like we were talking about in the onboarding where, okay, what's the best out of these 4 and what's the worst? Or put them in order. They're not just spitting out rote answers. They're actually owning the information and thinking about it. So some of the words that tie into knowing are recall, discuss, sequence. So that's just showing that they've memorized the information and they can spit it back to you. Doing, you get words like differentiate, compare, prepare, or use. So it's much more active sounding. And then once you get into critically thinking, you've got things like prioritize, create, develop, assess. So we're moving into that much more, I've owned this and now it's affecting a change in what I do and I'm using it on a regular basis to make my decisions different than what they were before. So I mentioned that there's not that big of a gap between adult and child learners. And when I was learning how to teach in college, they had methods of teaching. And one of the techniques that they speak highly of is using what they call teachable moments. And so you take an opportunity where a learner is in the middle of a situation that you've probably talked about once before or twice before, or in my case, 50 times before, and you seize the opportunity to teach them in the moment, which now is much more, it creates that necessity for them, because I'm stuck in this moment, and you may have told me this 16 times, but I never cared before, but now I'm actually here in the moment, and I need to know how to fix this. So one of my teachable moments was I had explained multiple times over. My dad had this saying, use things for what they were made for, and it drove me crazy, and then I started using it in kindergarten because I just realized how many things could be used for things they weren't made for. And I had explained how to sit in a chair multiple times, and no one cared. And lo and behold, I'm in the middle of teaching, and Jack starts crying, and he has turned the chair into a jungle gym, and somehow, you know how chairs in kindergarten, there's like the back piece and the seat? He's gotten stuck with his bum hanging out the back end of the chair, and he can't get out of the chair. And so as a good kindergarten teacher, instead of getting him out of the chair immediately, I go, ooh, can someone tell me what Jack might or might not have been doing? Is he using the chair for what it was made for? And we had a moment of just talking through whether that was what chairs were made for or not. Meanwhile, Jack's over there crying, and I was hoping not to get a note from his parent. But, we wedged him out. We covered him in butter and just slid him out the back. But it was a teachable moment, and you have those moments with adults, too. You just have to work a little harder for them. To his point, you don't want to induce a child into distress to be able to have that teachable moment. So there's other ways to go about doing that. We're going to use the example of compliance training because it is some of the most dry training that you would have to effectually deliver, but it is also very important for people to absorb this. So a typical compliance training might go something like this. The motivation is penalty-based. The objective might read, pass this, or, we get penalized and you're fired. Or much like your mother used to say, because I said so. So not so much of a what's in it for me, but there's your typical objective with compliance training. The focus is usually on the rules and regulations. We're trying to get them to memorize the different things that have to be done and why, and spit it back out again, which leads to limited interaction, really. They're just regurgitating as much as they can remember from the 30-minute PowerPoint or the hour-long PowerPoint. And it's measured by a multiple choice or a true-false, so it's mostly recall. And if you remember Bloom's taxonomy, that's way over here on the left. So they're just looking at your PowerPoint, trying to remember, or they're taking notes, and then they're just answering the questions at the end and moving on. A behavior-based compliance training might be something like this. The motivation would be what's in it for me. So what you're going to do is you're going to focus on changing their behavior. And the rules and regulations are now used as a job aid. They are not the entire focus of your PowerPoint or your training. It is just there as you need to know where to reference these rules and regulations and how to apply them to the situations you're going to run into. So what not to do and the consequences, what you should do and the consequences of not doing that, and how do I go about reporting violations and things of that nature. So we encourage a lot of scenario-based, obviously, interaction so that they can apply those types of things in real life. The reality is if you provide them with where to go to access some of these rules and regulations and they're aware of it and they know it, then they're going to be able to apply that in real life. So the mastery of this is now measured by them checking themselves and by the scenarios where you're watching them perform and seeing if they've kind of gotten the gist of where we're going with this compliance training, and if they don't know the answer, where to go and get the answer before they make their decision. So again, we moved from recall to applying and then assessing on that slide. So here's an experience. It's kind of a comparison side by side visually of those two that we just discussed. A compliance or a non-what's in it for me approach would be this type of a learning experience where you have the multiple choice as a professional, when is it acceptable to accept gifts from clients, and then you have the 4 options. In this particular one, we have a scenario. So Deborah's been working as a hospice nurse for 5 months for Mrs. Harris. And then during the holidays, the family gifts her with this huge basket that has all of these goodies in there. And can she accept the gift? And the questions are real life. It's, she can accept the gift because it's the holidays. The gift is worth more than $25, so she has to decline. She's not allowed, but she does so that she won't hurt the family's feelings. There's a lot of things going through someone's head in scenarios, even in the dry world of compliance. And so getting them to think through that in advance during these types of scenarios allows them then to take that knowledge and start applying it in a real life way in their mind when they're thinking about it. So they're assessing the situation. They're applying the knowledge from that ethics manual. And just real quick to go back, the bottom there has a reference to the ethics manual. So in other words, when they're going through this training, they have the link right there to access it. Again, it's not the focus of the whole slide. It's the reference that you can, this is where you go find it. Here's who you can ask for help. Here's who you should report things to. So creating that learning experience can take on a variety of forms. We've talked today about simulations, but there's other ways to create that type of experience and engage the learner. So there's a process around creating training that we need to take into consideration, and you need to evaluate your resources. Again, kind of bringing in the real life factor here. Not everybody can manage 40 sim labs or have the resources to do things technologically that you would want to do. But do you have access to somebody that's a subject matter expert? Do you incorporate any kind of planning in your training, or is it just kind of at the last minute, oh, we need to do some compliance training, or we need to, and how does that get built? Do you start with the end in mind? So are you looking at those outcomes that you're trying to change and trying to work backward from that to adjust training to fit that? So, instead of doing the same cookie cutter training, let's target our areas where we feel we're weak, or areas where in analytics compared to our peers in the area we aren't measuring up, or where we know that there's room for growth, and target those areas and work backward and design training to fit those. And then write those objectives the way we talked about with a what's in it for me and correlate them to that content. So this is a tool that we use as we build training where I work now, and this is a tool that I'm familiar with as an educator as well. But Gagne's 9 events of instruction basically walk you through that planning phase. It's a tool to use to kind of map out or storyboard your training and make sure that you're engaging the learner early on. Make sure that you're putting that need to know at the front and center. So think Jack stuck in the chair. You want that person to sense that need to learn right away and enter into the learning experience. So he suggests starting out with getting their attention. So Jack wedged in a chair. I had his utmost attention. Okay, we were ready to talk about what my objective was and why he needed to get there. So, but we'd laugh, but that's the kind of thing that the idea that you can fail in a safe environment, that gets your learners' attention. They realize, oh, you know what, I thought I knew this, but I don't. I thought I knew everything about nursing, but turns out I'm missing some key components about this particular situation. And so now all of a sudden I have a vested interest in learning the rest of what's in this course. Then you can describe your objective and what they'll be able to accomplish. And then you're going to try to simulate or stimulate recall of prior knowledge. So, access memories that they have of a certain situation, bring to the forefront scenarios that they might have been in, like the one that we looked at where Deborah got offered the gift basket. A lot of people can probably relate to that in a compliance training, a scenario like that. It's going to access prior knowledge, and they're going to go, yeah, you know what, I had that happen to me one time. And then you present the material. Gagne recommends doing it in smaller chunks to avoid overload, and give them guidance strategies. So again, you're not making the manual or the actual details necessarily the focus. You're telling them where to go get them. You're giving them tools and resources to help remember the information, and then allow them to practice it. So that practicing is going to give you an opportunity to do more guidance. It's kind of 5 and 6 might go back and forth as they move through the learning stages, and kind of you'd uncover areas where they might need more training. Giving feedback, explain the why, not just yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong. Again, what's in it for me? Those 5-year-olds always asking why. We just have this need to know, and as adults, we just don't say why as often, but we still have that need to know why did I not get it right? And it'll, again, if you know why, it'll affect the behavior on the next one much more than just, oh, it's C, not A, and just changing that to be done with it. assess their performance, and then enhance the retention and transfer. So don't just do the training and be done with it. Make sure that there's additional recall of that training or refreshers. We use this thing at Relias called Brain Sparks, where we'll send out a question, and it's at certain targeted intervals where it'll just kind of bring back what you learned about, so that you're not doing the training and then moving on with your life and not continuing to think about what you had just learned. We've all been in situations, I know it happens to me at conferences, where I write down all these really great things that I'm going to change, and then you get back and real life hits and it just kind of disappears into the back. So making sure that you're bringing this up regularly and finding ways to bring it up with your learners will help them to retain that and then transfer it. So some of the learning trends that are really helpful for entering into that learning experience. Test and then tell. So this targets specifically getting you to that point where you realize what exactly you don't know and engaging you in that way. So that test then tell, and you realize, oh, wow, I really didn't know as much as I thought I did. I've forgotten a lot, or, I'm doing pretty good, but I could use some work on these areas. It'll get that engagement right away. So it's like discovery learning, basically. They're discovering on their own what it is they need to know and what it is that they already are comfortable with, or things like that. And they're using critical thinking skills, and they can learn from those mistakes. Make sure I'm staying on time here. We use branching scenarios too. I like to call these, and again, this is the kindergarten teacher in me, but the choose your own adventure book kind of thing, where you go through and you're allowed to try out your thoughts about how a certain scenario might play itself out. And so it'll kind of take you through those different things in the PowerPoint, and you might go, okay, well, I choose this, and then it'll go, oh no, that was the wrong choice. And then you kind of flip back to where you didn't fall off the cliff and try to start over on the book. So that's like that, but for your job. And so we've created a lot of those. Those are pretty easy to work through in a storyboard fashion, where you can create some of these scenarios where they can see the consequences of their decisions and then make changes and learn from their mistakes. And then simulations. We've talked about these. Very helpful tool. And they can be done online, they can be done in person, and you don't even really have to necessarily have a sim lab. You can walk through simulations. I mean, having been in sales it's been a hot minute, but was in sales for a while, and that was our dreaded piece, was doing the role playing and enacting, but it does trigger those kinds of reactions. And interestingly enough, biologically speaking, when you're in a simulation, they've done studies where your physiological reactions are the same as if you were in that real scenario. It will mirror what you would have gone through in that scenario. So, much like a fire drill, where it's all well and good to know what the process is, but when the smoke's coming out and there's alarms everywhere and lights are flashing, you panic. This is kind of that same mentality, where you're trying to get them to experience and enter into it as much as they possibly can. So the objectives for the course today, let's see if anybody might be able to tell me what they thought my objectives were. I didn't start out with it. So, pop quiz. Does anybody think they might know what my objectives were in the course? Go ahead.
Get Jack out of the chair.
My objective in life. Jack's mom probably was not a big fan of me. Objectives for this particular training. We had apply the principles of knowing versus doing. So know how to build training that is targeting the doing and not so much just spitting back the knowledge. Compare and contrast two methods for creating learning stickiness. So are there any methods you can think of that I used in this particular training? Because in real life, again, it's not all going to be online. It's going to be some type of blended learning. What are some things that you can use even in live training to create learning stickiness? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the use of instructional design to increase learner engagement. So different methods beyond just a click through PowerPoint. Can we do interviews? Can we do ride-alongs? Can we do, in student teaching, a big part of it, they actually run into very similar to what some of the things that you all run into with teaching, where they've had all this training and then they get in front of a classroom and go, this is not what I signed up for, which is part of the whole reason why. And in fact, the school that I went to required you to start volunteering in schools as soon as you came in, your freshman year, even if it was just as a TA, to get in there, get used to the environment, and see what it was you were getting yourself into. So there's a lot of things that you can take, and it's not just instructional design. There's a lot of different ways to engage your learner in a way that's meaningful to them and creates that what's in it for me. So again, real life. How do we do this in real life? Not all education is online. It's a combination of blended learning. We have limited resources and time. In here, in your training programs, I'm really curious to hear what are some things that you do, whether it's in your onboarding or whether it's in your continuing education. What are some things that have worked and haven't worked? What have you experienced in real life?
Really scheduling out, like on a new orientation, certain criteria and mentoring and preceptorship, but also going back to the classroom and using videos, and also on hands-on, a mixture of everything.
So that's worked well. How do you measure your training? Do you measure effectiveness of it? Have you done any kind of, what's your criteria basically? Like when you've done the training, because we're talking about the condition and then the criteria at the end is with 100% accuracy, or do you have like expectations at the end of your trainings that you put in place?
Well, we do now that we have Reliance.
No.
Testing, because that was what we were lacking.
Okay.
We're lacking some testing of it, even though the preceptor would report back on competencies, but some of the more, some of the stuff it was hard to capture, so we invested in Reliance to help us with some of the testing.
So a system to track it all in and do some kind of metric tracking. I mean, and there's a lot out there, but, and continuing, we've been talking even today about assessments, and finding a way to get all of that data in one place. Data is so huge right now. Anyone else have some teaching? Who's involved currently with continuing training or training in some aspect? Yeah.
One of the things we've just recently done was we kind of changed our focus. We talked a lot about culture and your work environment stuff. One of the things that we realized was our orientation was geared toward the staff becoming oriented to our needs, to be checked off, to be able to go into the field to meet regulatory requirements and everything else. And reality was we were missing out the focus, which is this is the employee's orientation. And the employees needed to play a more active role in feeling like it was their orientation to help them be better prepared to do their job, not to complete a checklist, to have them ready to go out and see patients and take off over a caseload. And so we really tried to engage them more in being a part of owning that orientation and gearing it more toward this is your orientation. It's no longer a supervisor has a checklist to make sure you've done everything. This is yours. Let's make sure you've got what you need to feel comfortable to assume your role. So it's kind of a shift in the focus.
Yeah, and that would create, imagine being handed that and going, this is yours, what do you need from us to go out there and do this effectively? All of a sudden I'm panicking. I'm going, oh dear, well I better make sure I have everything instead of just going, oh, check this off, check this off. So they take ownership in that, and now there's a what's in it for me.
We still have mentors and preceptors and everything else, but this, it just changed.
Puts the onus on them.
It's not, I got to do this for the company. It's now, I'm doing this for me. So I'm better prepared.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah.
How does your model change when it's not your employee that you're trying to train?
Give me an example.
Okay, so if, suppose it's the employee of an assisted living organization,
Okay.
and you're trying to pass on use of tools that can be used in a dementia setting. That's, so it's non-employee, it's kind of think of it like a consumer. What's in it for me is still important.
Most of our courses are geared toward your employees or individual learners who are going out and getting that on their own. I would say in that particular case, there's a relationship there. Find a way to make that person engaged. Find what is in it for them in that relationship with you. So in other words, if you're in that assisted living scenario, are they concerned about what are their concerns? What is important to them in their job function, and find a way to tie it into that. How are they getting measured as an employee where they are? They might not be your employee, but they're getting measured by someone. What is that measurement, and how do you help them get there? Any other thoughts about what might have worked or not worked in your trainings that anybody wants to share?
I will say the thing that improved our scenario was we went from trying to train for the purpose of learning to moving to very specific moments of when it would provide knowledge or insight that was necessary at the moment for the task.
So the teachable moment, basically. Yeah.
And just completely abandoning the idea of trying to, in a broad way, bring a person along and understand the concepts and method. Just basically said the heck with that and went down to specifics.
Yeah. And that does a couple things. It engages you right away, right? Because you have that immediate need to learn. So they're hungry for it. And it's doing it in short bursts, like we talked about. So I think a lot of times what we want to do is give them all the information up front. And a lot of times we can't process it all. Oftentimes when you're entering into a new role, you haven't even created the filing system yet in the filing cabinet to where to put all this information. So giving that in spurts like that, when it's needed, when it makes sense, when it's relevant, helps them absorb it and go, oh, this is the context, and then know how to retain it better. So I think that's great. How do you do that practically speaking? So is that still in training but just in a scenario environment, or is that in on the job? Do you have somebody like escorting them in their job and doing that as they're going through?
No, we did it through a downloadable application where they get a push notification. So if they inquire, then it's going to back it up.
Okay.
Provide information. So, we have the online, we still do have online training, but that's more, getting people familiar.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, what we really train for is knowing how to access the tool.
Great.
And then if you access the tool, then it'll give you an answer.
Great. That's great.
But it really, I think probably the historic disappointment in that was that we had a lot of people that really wanted to train people with the idea that advancing their knowledge, advancing their career. And the way I look at this is it's more addressing maybe the chaotic nature and the on-the-job training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, you can kind of do a little bit of a mix of both. You can do the professional development training for their career, but some of it is more effective if it's done like you're describing, I think, how to get the resources. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, building on what they were saying, we looked at all of our orientation, what stuff was one directional versus what was two directional, and anything where we looked back and saw that it was more providing information and wasn't really interactive. We made self-directed learning modules that they could do on their own time, so that when they did come in for orientation, it was things more geared to what were they looking for, what information they need, and kind of allowed more for it to be an interactive process rather than just sitting through watching a video or something else that they could do from the comfort of their home.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Danielle, did you say you had something?
I didn't share one of the consistent failures that I was called to, that as a leader, one of the ways that I was constantly, oh yeah, that failed for that same reason, was the lack of preparedness from the preceptor or mentor, and that continuously, maybe I'm the one who's guilty of this, but continuously guilty of, you're a really strong
Yeah.
Yeah, we had the same problem with our, and that was when we had the most pushback for wanting to develop the preceptors, and people confused, well, this person's really not knowledgeable with them being a good preceptor, and it wasn't until we started surveying the residents and were able to take back those surveys to people saying, I know you think that she's an expert and she can take the event apart and put it back together again, but, you know, look at these survey results. That doesn't make her a good preceptor or a good trainer. And then that's when we finally got the permission to move ahead and create a special preceptor development program that taught them a lot of those skills. And a lot of times it was just that nobody had taught them how to be a preceptor. They wanted to be when nobody had taught them how to come up with scenarios, how to stimulate critical thinking or any of that stuff. So,
I don't know about anything else, but I wasn't even off orientation as a grad nurse.
and you would
Before I was already accepted, you know, the do one, teach one thing. I mean, I'm not the only nurse in the room who went through that, right? And it goes hand in hand, I have found, with the concepts of frankly, viral violence or nursing when they're young, that by and large, we're unprepared to be teaching each other, so our defense mechanisms, you know, and we end up doing what we all say we don't want to do, just make the new person feel bad or uncomfortable. And really, really vicious in, you know, this whole cycle. And, you know, it's intriguing to me. I see Lisa over there nodding, and I'm sure that a big chunk of investment was made in preparing the people who will be preparing the new staff. And it leads me to another question, if I may, for the group about how do you make a financial case for investing in some of these techniques and strategies and lengthy orientation. I mean, you know, we've all held our nose and hired a new person, right? Because you had to have somebody. So how do you really make the financial case to invest in, we have to have a 12-week program where they can't have full assignment until they get to class for 8 days, or, you know, we're talking about things that cost a lot in the real world. We really have to look at your data.
Yeah.
Years ago, we had a 60% turnover. We were going through a phase, and we didn't have an orientation program that was successful. We didn't have a preceptive program, and you have to do your research. And we built a preceptive program that was very successful, and you know, our turnover rates below the norm now. But it's again, looking at your preceptor, you have to do the training. You have to get volunteers. You can't force people to be a preceptor because not everyone has those skills, and there's so many different aspects of a really good preceptor program. And it's the constant. It's not just the one-time training. It's the constant training. It's the feedback. What worked, what didn't work.
I would agree with you. Data is going to be the thing that speaks up for most cost initiatives at any company. It doesn't just matter if it's in healthcare and anywhere. It's data is going to. Go ahead.
I think also to answer your question, Danielle, before we have the data, right? It's great we have data, but I think that we have to look at the whole business model and make changes in the whole business model. So we found we were wasting money in our supply chain, in every supply area, not because we thought about it. I mean, it was just, those were the vendors we used all the time. What programs did we not really use? So it's really a strategic analogy or analysis of your whole business plan. And it really is take from one place and put in another. Because we're not increasing our top line revenues as much as some of these things might indicate. We're really kind of balancing. So we found really looking at your supply chain, looking at your business model, and looking to switch off some things instead of others.
And I think you referenced that even earlier when we were talking about the onboarding, and it's it's a balance. You find ways to move from Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. Yeah.
I would say that absolutely comes into play because it really locks in the executive commitment to the initiative, which does get painful. And I think one of the steps that I found surprisingly difficult was getting the right content experts together and getting them working together, because these personalities kind of kick in and take control, and so you start, you have to have the content experts in order to get the materials together, because you can't expect a training company to understand all the ins and outs, so you've got to participate actively in this. And that drives cost up in a way that most people don't pencil out when you start the journey. The extra time that it takes, and how many bodies are involved with the creation of the material. So that's one thing that we went through. It really requires somebody that has some process capability.
Yes.
Which is not always in the same body as the content experts.
Mm-hmm.